27-year-old Charlotte Whitaker stepped off the dusty stagecoach in Black Ridge, Wyoming, clutching 4 handwritten letters promising her a new life as a mail-order bride, only to discover the man she came to marry never wrote them, never asked for a wife, and stood frozen in fury as the entire town watched her humiliation unfold. The letters came from his 8-year-old son, desperate to save his father from drowning in grief. Now stranded 1,000 miles from home with nowhere left to run, Charlotte faces an impossible choice: leave with nothing, or stay 1 week on a collapsing ranch and fight for a family that doesn't want her. If you want to see how far love, courage, and sacrifice can carry 3 broken strangers in the harshest corner of the American frontier, stay with me until the end. And don't forget to hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the Black Ridge General Store, and Charlotte Whitaker pressed her hand against the worn leather seat to steady herself. Dust swirled through the open window, coating her navy traveling dress and the small leather bag clutched in her lap. She'd been on the road for 9 days, Boston to Chicago by rail, then the long, bone-rattling journey west through Nebraska and into Wyoming territory. Every mile had carried her farther from everything she knew and closer to a life she'd only imagined through 4 carefully written letters. She stepped down onto the wooden planks, her boots clicking softly. The town spread out before her like something from a half-finished painting. A wide dirt street, low buildings with peeling paint, a saloon with broken shutters, mountains rising in the distance, blue and impossibly far away. A few men loitered near the hitching post, watching her with the flat curiosity of people who had nothing better to do. A woman in a faded calico dress stood in the doorway of the mercantile, one hand shading her eyes. Charlotte smoothed the front of her skirt and tried not to look as nervous as she felt. She'd come all this way because of those letters, 4 of them, written in careful, uneven script, each one signed Silas Boone, each one asking her to come. "I need someone who understands loneliness," the first letter had said. "Someone who won't judge a man for what he's lost." She'd answered, and he'd written back. Now she was here. "You the woman from Boston?" Charlotte turned. A man stood a few feet away, tall and lean, with a weathered face and gray streaks in his dark hair. He wore a dusty coat and a hat pulled low over his eyes. "Yes," she said, "Charlotte Whitaker. I'm looking for Silas Boone." The man's expression didn't change. He glanced past her toward the stagecoach driver, who was hauling down her trunk. Then he looked back at her. "You're looking at him." Charlotte's breath caught. This was him. The man from the letters, the one who'd written about grief and second chances and needing someone to help him remember what hope felt like. "Mr. Boone," she said, and she could hear the tremor in her voice. "I got your letters. All 4 of them. What letters?" The words hit her like a slap. She stared at him. "The letters you sent me, starting in March. You said you needed—" "I didn't send you anything." Charlotte's stomach dropped. She fumbled with the clasp on her bag, pulling out the folded pages she'd read so many times the creases had started to tear. She held them out. "You wrote these. You asked me to come." Silas took the letters. His face went hard as he scanned the first page, then the second. His jaw tightened. "I didn't write these." "But they're signed." "I don't care what they're signed." He thrust the letters back at her. "I never wrote to you. I never asked you to come here. I don't know who you are or what kind of game this is, but you need to get back on that stagecoach and go home." Charlotte felt the blood drain from her face. Around them, people were starting to gather. The men from the hitching post, the woman in the doorway, a shopkeeper wiping his hands on his apron, all of them watching. "I sold everything I had to come here," Charlotte said quietly. "I don't have a home to go back to." "That's not my problem." "Mr. Boone, please." "No." His voice was flat, final. "I don't know who told you to come here, but it wasn't me. I didn't ask for a wife. I don't want a wife. You made a mistake." He turned and started walking toward a wagon hitched at the far end of the street. Charlotte stood frozen, the letters still clutched in her hand. Her vision blurred. She could feel every pair of eyes on her, the whispers starting, the judgment. She'd left Boston because there was nothing left for her there. Her father had died 2 years ago, leaving debts she couldn't pay. Her engagement to William Thatcher, a safe, respectable match, had ended when his family decided she wasn't worth the scandal of a bankrupt bride. She'd been living in a boarding house, working as a seamstress, watching her life shrink smaller and smaller until the walls felt like they were closing in. And then the first letter had arrived. "I'm not a man who knows how to ask for help," it had said. "But I'm asking now." She'd written back because she had nothing to lose, because the loneliness in those words felt like her own, because she thought maybe, just maybe, she could start over. Now she was standing in the middle of a dusty street in Wyoming, and the man who was supposed to be her second chance was walking away. "Papa, wait!" The voice was small and high. Charlotte turned. A boy came running from behind the general store. He was thin, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with dark hair that stuck up in the back and a shirt that looked 2 sizes too big. He skidded to a stop in front of Silas, breathing hard. "Papa, is she here? Is she the lady?" Silas's face went stiff. "Eli, go back to the wagon." "But I saw the stagecoach and I thought," "Now, Eli." The boy's face crumpled. He looked past his father toward Charlotte, and something passed across his expression. Hope, maybe, or fear, or both. Charlotte's chest tightened. The boy had written the letters. She didn't know how she knew, but she did. The careful handwriting, the uneven spacing, the way the ink smudged in places, like small hands had pressed too hard. Silas grabbed his son's shoulder and steered him toward the wagon. The boy looked back once, his eyes wide and wet, and then they were gone. Charlotte stood there, her trunk at her feet, the letters still in her hand. The woman from the mercantile stepped down into the street. She was older, maybe 50, with sharp eyes and a mouth that looked like it didn't smile often. "You really came all the way from Boston thinking Silas Boone wanted a wife?" Charlotte didn't answer. "Well," the woman said, "you picked the wrong man. Silas hasn't wanted anything since his wife died 3 years ago. He barely speaks, barely eats. That boy of his is the only thing keeping him upright." She paused. "There's a boarding house 2 streets over. Mrs. Calloway rents rooms by the week. You'll want to talk to her before you figure out what to do next." Charlotte nodded numbly. The woman walked back inside, and the crowd began to drift away, their entertainment over. Charlotte picked up her trunk, heavier than she remembered, and started walking. The boarding house was a narrow 2-story building with faded yellow paint and a sagging porch. Mrs. Calloway was a round-faced woman with flour on her apron and a voice that could cut through walls. $2 a week, she said, meals included, but you eat what I make, and I don't make much. Charlotte paid for 1 week. It was most of the money she had left. Her room was on the 2nd floor, barely big enough for a bed and a washstand. The window overlooked the street, and through it she could see the mountains in the distance, silent and unmoved by her disaster. She sat on the edge of the bed and read the letters again. "I have a son," one of them said. "He's 8 years old, and he doesn't smile anymore. I don't know how to fix that. The ranch is falling apart. I can't keep up with it. I need help. I'm not asking you to love me. I'm asking you to stay." She folded the letters carefully and set them on the washstand. Then she cried. She didn't leave her room the next day, or the day after that. Mrs. Calloway knocked once to bring her a plate of beans and cornbread, but Charlotte barely touched it. She lay on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to figure out what came next. She couldn't go back to Boston. There was nothing there. No family. No friends who hadn't turned their backs when the money ran out. William had married someone else 6 months ago. She'd seen the announcement in the paper, but she couldn't stay here either. Not in a town where everyone had watched her get humiliated, not with $2 left to her name and no prospects. On the 3rd morning, someone knocked on her door. Charlotte sat up, her hair tangled and her dress wrinkled from sleeping in it. "Who is it?" "It's me." The voice was small, uncertain. Charlotte opened the door. The boy, Eli, stood in the hallway, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He looked up at her with round, dark eyes. "How did you find me?" Charlotte asked. "Mrs. Calloway told me you were staying here." He shifted his weight. "Can I come in?" Charlotte hesitated, then stepped back. Eli walked into the room and looked around like he'd never seen anything so small. He sat on the edge of the bed, his feet dangling a few inches above the floor. "You wrote the letters," Charlotte said. Eli nodded. "Why?" He stared at his hands. "Because Papa's sad all the time. He doesn't talk anymore. He just works, and then he sits in the dark, and sometimes I think he forgets I'm even there." His voice was barely a whisper. Mama died when I was 5. I don't remember her very much, but Papa does. And it's like he's still stuck the day she left. Charlotte sat down beside him. I found Mama's old letters in a box, Eli continued, from before they got married, and I thought, maybe if I wrote to someone, they'd come and help us. Help him. So you pretended to be your father. Eli nodded again, his eyes filling with tears. I didn't mean to trick you. I just didn't know what else to do. Charlotte felt something crack open in her chest. This boy, this child, had been so desperate to save his father that he'd written to a stranger 1,000 miles away. Does your father know you're here? She asked. No, he thinks I'm at the mercantile. Eli, he doesn't want me here. He made that very clear. I know. Eli wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. But I thought maybe if you stayed just a little while, he'd see. He'd remember. Remember what? What it's like to have someone. Charlotte looked at him, this skinny, sad-eyed boy who'd taken on a weight no child should carry. I can't stay, she said gently. Your father doesn't want me on his ranch. Then just come for a week, please. Eli's voice broke. Just 1 week. I'll do all the chores. I'll help you with anything. Just don't leave yet. Charlotte closed her eyes. She thought about Boston, about the boarding house where she'd lived alone, about the seamstress shop where she'd hemmed skirts for women who wouldn't meet her eyes, about the hollow, airless feeling of a life that had stopped meaning anything. She thought about the letters, about the raw honesty in them, even if they'd come from a child's hand. I'm not asking you to love me. I'm asking you to stay. She opened her eyes. 1 week, she said. Eli's face lit up like someone had struck a match inside him. The Boone Ranch was 5 miles outside of town, down a rutted dirt road that cut through open grassland. Charlotte rode in the back of a hired wagon, her trunk bouncing beside her, while Eli sat up front with the driver. The boy talked the entire way, about the ranch, about the horses, about the barn cat that only had 3 legs. He didn't mention his father. When they arrived, Charlotte understood why. The ranch house was a low, rough-built structure with a sagging roof and shutters that hung crooked. The yard was overgrown with weeds. A broken fence post leaned at an angle near the barn. Everything looked like it had been abandoned halfway through and never picked up again. The wagon driver set her trunk down in the dirt and left without a word. Eli led her up the porch steps. The boards creaked under their weight. Papa's out checking the fence line, he said. He won't be back till dark. Inside, the house was worse. The main room was dim and cold, even in the July heat. Dust coated every surface. The table was piled with papers and unwashed dishes. The fireplace was full of ash. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floor. It felt like a place where people had stopped trying. This is it, Eli said quietly. Charlotte set her bag down and looked around. She'd grown up in a narrow brownstone in Boston with peeling wallpaper and cramped rooms, but it had always been clean. Her father might have been poor, but he taught her that dignity didn't cost anything. This wasn't poverty. This was surrender. Where do you sleep? She asked. Eli pointed to a small room off the kitchen. Charlotte looked inside. The bed was unmade. Clothes were piled in the corner. A tin plate with dried food sat on the floor. And your father? Upstairs. Charlotte didn't go up. Instead, she rolled up her sleeves. By the time the sun started to sink, she'd swept the floors, scrubbed the table, washed the dishes, and hauled out 3 buckets of trash. Eli helped, carrying things outside and fetching water from the pump. He didn't complain once. Charlotte found a few potatoes and an onion in the pantry and made a thin soup. It wasn't much, but it was hot. She was ladling it into bowls when the door opened. Silas stood in the doorway, covered in dust and sweat, his hat in his hand. He stared at her. What the hell are you doing in my house? Charlotte set down the ladle. Your son asked me to stay for a week. I agreed. Silas's jaw clenched. He looked at Eli, who'd gone very still. You brought her here? Eli nodded, his voice small. I thought, you don't think. That's the problem. Silas turned back to Charlotte. Get out. No. The word hung in the air. Silas's eyes narrowed. What did you just say? I said no. Charlotte's hands were shaking, but she kept her voice steady. I came 1,000 miles because your son sent me letters begging me to help. I sold everything I had. I have nowhere else to go, and I told him I'd stay 1 week. I don't care what you told him. Well, I do. Charlotte stepped forward. He's 8 years old, and he's trying to hold this place together because you won't. He wrote those letters because he's scared. He's scared you're disappearing. And maybe you are. Silas's face went white. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Silas turned and walked out. The door slammed behind him. Eli's eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Charlotte knelt down in front of him. It's all right. He hates me. No, he doesn't. He's just... She paused, searching for the right words. He's hurting, and hurt people don't always know how to let anyone help. Eli wiped his eyes. Are you leaving? Charlotte looked around the dim, cold house, at the soup on the stove, at the boy in front of her who'd carried a weight no child should carry. Not yet, she said. Silas didn't come back that night. Charlotte made up a bed for herself on a bench in the kitchen, and Eli went to his room without a word. She lay awake for hours, listening to the wind rattling the shutters and wondering what the hell she'd just done. In the morning, she found Silas in the barn. He was mucking out a stall, his movements sharp and angry. He didn't look up when she walked in. I made coffee, Charlotte said. Don't want any? There's bread, too. I said I don't want any. Charlotte crossed her arms. Fine. Then I'll say what I came to say, and you can go back to ignoring me. Silas stopped working. He didn't turn around. I know you didn't ask for this, Charlotte said. I know you think I'm an intruder. Maybe I am. But your son is trying to save you, and he shouldn't have to do that alone. He doesn't need saving. I'm not talking about him. Silas turned, his face hard. You don't know anything about me. I know you're drowning, Charlotte said quietly. I know what that looks like. I've been there. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or recognition, but he buried it fast. 1 week, he said. Then you're gone. 1 week, Charlotte agreed. He turned back to the stall. Charlotte walked out of the barn, her heart pounding. The days fell into a rhythm. Charlotte woke before dawn and started a fire in the stove. She made coffee and porridge, and Eli ate without being told. Silas came in from the barn, took his plate outside, and ate alone on the porch. She cleaned, she cooked, she mended the torn curtains she found in a trunk upstairs and hung them in the windows. She weeded the garden plot behind the house and found a few struggling tomato plants buried under the overgrowth. Eli followed her everywhere. He helped her carry water. He showed her where the chickens laid eggs. He talked, endlessly, desperately, about everything and nothing. About the horse he wanted to train, about the fox he'd seen near the creek, about his mother, who used to sing while she cooked. Do you remember her? Charlotte asked one afternoon as they hung laundry on the line. Eli shook his head. Just little things. Her voice, the way she smelled like bread. He paused. Papa doesn't talk about her. Maybe it hurts too much. Maybe. Eli handed her a clothespin. Do you think he'll ever stop being sad? Charlotte didn't know how to answer that. On the 4th day, she found a slate board and a piece of chalk in Eli's room. Do you go to school? She asked. Eli shook his head. There's a schoolhouse in town, but Papa says it's too far. Can you read? A little. Mama taught me some letters before she died. Charlotte sat down at the table. Show me. Eli brought over a tattered book, a collection of Bible stories with water-stained pages. He stumbled through the first sentence, sounding out each word slowly. Charlotte's chest tightened. For the next hour she worked with him, sounding out words, writing letters on the slate. Eli's face lit up every time he got something right, and Charlotte realized with a start that this boy was smart. He just needed someone to notice. Silas walked in as they were finishing. He stood in the doorway, watching. Charlotte looked up. He's a quick learner. Silas didn't say anything, but he didn't leave either. That night, for the first time, he ate dinner inside. On the 5th day, Charlotte went into town for supplies. She walked, since Silas had taken the wagon to fix a fence, and the 5-mile trek gave her too much time to think. The mercantile was crowded when she arrived. Women clustered near the bolts of fabric, their voices low and sharp. When Charlotte walked in, they stopped talking. The shopkeeper, a thin man with spectacles, looked at her warily. "What can I do for you?" "I need flour, sugar, and lard," Charlotte said. He fetched the items without a word and set them on the counter. As Charlotte counted out her coins, one of the women stepped forward. She was tall and elegant, dressed in a dark green traveling suit that looked like it cost more than Charlotte had ever owned. "You're the woman staying at the Boone Ranch," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Charlotte said. "I'm Eleanor Voss." She said it like Charlotte should recognize the name. "My family owns the land east of Silas's property." Charlotte nodded politely. Eleanor's smile didn't reach her eyes. "It's very unusual for an unmarried woman to live on a man's ranch. People talk. Let them. I'm only saying this for your own good. A woman's reputation is a fragile thing out here. Once it's damaged, it's nearly impossible to repair." Charlotte met her gaze. "Thank you for your concern, but I'm fine." Eleanor's smile thinned. "Of course. I'm sure you know what you're doing." She swept out of the store, and the other women followed. Charlotte paid for her supplies and left. On the walk back, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, that the town's curiosity had turned into something sharper. That night, she asked Silas about Eleanor Voss. They were sitting on the porch after supper, Eli asleep inside, the stars just starting to appear. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Her father owned half the territory before he died. Now Eleanor runs it. She's been trying to buy my land for 2 years. "Why won't you sell?" "Because it's mine." His voice was flat. "My wife and I built this place. I'm not handing it over to someone who wants to carve it up and sell it for profit." Charlotte nodded slowly. She seemed pointed. "Eleanor doesn't do anything without a reason." Silas glanced at her. "She's probably heard you're staying here. She'll use it if she can." "Use it how?" "To make me look unfit, morally questionable, anything that gives her leverage to contest my ownership." Charlotte's stomach tightened. "I didn't know." "You wouldn't." Silas stood. "One more day. Then you're gone, and this stops being a problem." He walked inside. Charlotte stayed on the porch, staring out at the dark shapes of the mountains. One more day. But on the 6th morning, Charlotte woke to the sound of hooves. She stepped outside and saw 3 men on horseback riding up to the house. They wore suits and badges, official-looking. Silas was already in the yard, his arms crossed. The lead man dismounted. He was older, gray-haired, with a face like carved stone. "Silas Boone?" "That's me." "I'm Inspector Garrett with the Territorial Land Office. We've received a formal complaint regarding improper cohabitation on this property." Charlotte's breath caught. Silas's jaw tightened. "What complaint?" Garrett pulled out a folded paper. "A concerned citizen has reported that an unmarried woman is residing on your ranch without chaperone or legal standing. That constitutes a violation of territorial morality statutes. She's been here less than a week." "The duration is irrelevant." Garrett's gaze shifted to Charlotte. "Are you Miss Charlotte Whitaker of Boston, Massachusetts?" Charlotte stepped forward. "I am." "And you are unmarried?" "Yes." "Then I'm afraid you'll need to vacate this property immediately, or Mr. Boone will face legal penalties, including potential forfeiture of his land claim." The words hit like a hammer. Silas's face went pale. "You can't do that." "I can, and I will, unless the situation is resolved within 24 hours. Garrett folded the paper and tucked it back into his coat. "I'll return tomorrow to confirm compliance." He mounted his horse, and the 3 men rode away. Charlotte stood frozen. Eli came running out of the house, his face white. "Papa, what's happening?" Silas didn't answer. He turned and walked toward the barn. Charlotte followed him. Inside, Silas slammed his fist against a wooden post. The whole structure shuddered. "Silas, this is Eleanor." His voice was shaking. "She filed that complaint. She's been waiting for an excuse, and you gave it to her." "I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't fix this." He turned to face her, his eyes blazing. I told you to leave. I told you this would happen, but you stayed anyway. Because your son asked me to. My son is 8 years old. He doesn't understand what's at stake. Charlotte's throat tightened. What do you want me to do? Silas exhaled slowly, the fight draining out of him. Pack your things. I'll take you into town in the morning. And then what? They take your land anyway? I'll figure it out. How? He didn't answer. Charlotte looked at him. This man who'd been hollowed out by grief, who'd spent 3 years trying to disappear, who couldn't even see that he was still worth saving. There's another option, she said quietly. Silas's eyes narrowed. What? We get married. The silence stretched long and heavy. You're insane, Silas said finally. Maybe, but it solves the problem. If we're married, there's no violation. Eleanor has no grounds for a complaint. We don't even know each other. People marry for worse reasons out here. Silas shook his head. No, I'm not dragging you into this. You're not dragging me. I'm offering. Charlotte stepped closer. I have nowhere else to go. You need help keeping this place. Eli needs stability. It's practical. It's insane, Silas repeated. But his voice had lost some of its edge. 1 week ago, you told me to leave. I didn't. And in that week, your son started smiling again. He's learning to read. He's sleeping through the night. She paused. You don't have to love me. You don't even have to like me. But don't throw away the one chance you have to keep this ranch just because you're too stubborn to accept help. Silas stared at her. Then he turned and walked out. Charlotte didn't see him the rest of the day. Eli found her in the kitchen that evening, his eyes red. Are you leaving? He asked. Charlotte knelt down. I don't know yet. Please don't. His voice broke. Please. She pulled him into a hug and he clung to her like she was the only solid thing left in the world. When she went to bed that night, she didn't know what morning would bring. Max. She woke to the sound of boots on the porch. It was still dark outside. Charlotte sat up, her heart pounding. The door opened. Silas stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the faint gray light of dawn. If we do this, he said quietly, it's a legal arrangement. Nothing more. You help with the house and the boy. I work the ranch. We don't pretend it's anything it's not. Charlotte's breath caught. All right. And if you ever want to leave, you leave, no questions. Understood. Silas was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. We'll go into town this morning, find a preacher. He turned and walked back outside. Charlotte sat in the dark, her hands shaking. She'd just agreed to marry a man she barely knew. A man who didn't want her. A man who might never be anything more than a stranger. But as the first light crept through the window and she heard Eli's soft breathing from the other room, she realized something. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't afraid. She was still here, and that had to be enough. The preacher's house sat at the edge of town, a narrow structure with white paint peeling from the clapboard siding. Charlotte climbed down from the wagon, her dress still dusty from the road, and tried to steady her breathing. Silas tied off the horses without looking at her. Eli jumped down and grabbed her hand. Are you scared? The boy whispered. Charlotte squeezed his fingers. A little. Me too. Silas knocked on the door. A thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles answered, his shirt buttoned to the collar despite the heat. Silas Boone, the preacher said, surprised. I haven't seen you in church since... He stopped himself. What brings you here? We need to be married, Silas said flatly. Today. The preacher blinked. His gaze shifted to Charlotte, taking in her travel-worn dress and the way she stood slightly apart from Silas, like they were strangers meeting on a train platform. I see. And you are? Charlotte Whitaker. From where? Boston. The preacher's eyebrows lifted. That's quite a distance. He looked back at Silas. This is rather sudden. Can you do it or not? There was a long pause. The preacher's expression tightened, and Charlotte could see him working through the calculations, the rumors he'd heard, the territorial inspector's visit, the scandal brewing around the Boone Ranch. I can, he said carefully, but I'll need witnesses, and I'll need to file the certificate with the county clerk. Fine, we'll find witnesses. The preacher stepped back to let them inside. The front room was dim and smelled like old hymnals. A wooden cross hung on the wall, and Charlotte looked away from it quickly. "Wait here," the preacher said. "I'll get my book." He disappeared into a back room, leaving them standing in the narrow hallway. Eli leaned against Charlotte's side, and she rested her hand on his shoulder. Silas stared at the floor, his jaw tight. "Are you sure about this?" Charlotte asked quietly. No. The honesty startled her. She'd expected him to be cold, detached, businesslike. Instead, he just sounded tired. "We don't have to sit." "Yes, we do." Silas looked at her, and for the first time she saw something other than anger in his eyes. Fear, maybe, or resignation. "If we don't, I lose the ranch, and Eli loses the only home he's ever known." Charlotte nodded. The preacher returned with a worn, leather-bound book and two women from the neighboring house, middle-aged sisters who looked at Charlotte with open curiosity. They stood on either side of the room, their hands folded, their faces carefully neutral. "Shall we begin?" the preacher asked. Silas moved to stand beside Charlotte. He didn't take her hand. The preacher opened the book and started reading. The words washed over Charlotte in a blur. Duty, honor, commitment, vows she'd once imagined saying to someone who loved her. She barely heard them. Her focus kept drifting to Silas, to the hard line of his shoulders, to the way his hands hung stiffly at his sides. "Do you, Silas Boone, take this woman?" "I do." The words came out clipped, final. The preacher turned to Charlotte. "And do you, Charlotte Whitaker?" "I do." There was no ring, no kiss. The preacher closed the book and told them to sign the certificate, and Charlotte's hand shook as she wrote her name. Silas signed below her, his handwriting sharp and angular. "Congratulations," the preacher said, though his voice held no warmth. "You're now man and wife." Eli let out a breath that sounded like relief. One of the sisters leaned toward the other and whispered something Charlotte couldn't hear. Silas handed the preacher a few coins and walked out without a word. Charlotte followed him into the sunlight, her heart pounding in her ears. She was married, to a man who didn't want her, in a town that already hated her. She climbed into the wagon, and Silas snapped the reins. They rode back to the ranch in silence. Inspector Garrett arrived the next morning just after dawn. Charlotte was in the kitchen kneading dough when she heard the horses. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside. Silas was already in the yard, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Garrett dismounted slowly, his eyes moving from Silas to Charlotte and back again. "Mr. Boone," he said, "I've come to verify compliance." "We're married," Silas said, "as of yesterday." Garrett's expression didn't change. "I'll need to see the certificate." Silas went inside and returned with the paper. Garrett examined it closely, holding it up to the light, checking the signatures and the preacher's seal. "This appears to be in order," he said finally. He folded it and handed it back. "The complaint is dismissed." Charlotte felt the tension drain from her shoulders. But Garrett didn't leave. He stood there, his gaze sharp and assessing. "I'll be honest with you, Boone. There are people in this territory who don't believe this marriage is legitimate. They think it's a convenience, a way to skirt the law. I don't care what people think." "You should." Garrett's voice was cold. "If there's any indication this is a sham arrangement, the complaint will be refiled, and next time, a marriage certificate won't save you." He mounted his horse and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Charlotte looked at Silas. His face had gone pale. "What does he mean?" she asked. "He means Eleanor's not done. She's just getting started." Tick. The days that followed settled into a strange, fragile routine. Charlotte woke before sunrise and started the fire. She made coffee and breakfast, and Silas ate quickly before heading out to work the land. Eli stayed close to her, helping with chores, reading his lessons at the kitchen table. At night, Silas came in exhausted and covered in dirt. He washed at the pump, ate whatever Charlotte had cooked, and went upstairs without speaking. Charlotte slept in the small room off the kitchen, the one that had been meant for storage. Silas had cleared it out and brought in a narrow bed. It wasn't much, but it was hers. They barely spoke. But the house was changing. Charlotte scrubbed the floors until they gleamed. She planted seeds in the garden and hauled water to keep them alive in the brutal summer heat. She mended Silas's shirts and Eli's torn pants. She baked bread and hung curtains and swept the porch every morning. Slowly, the ranch stopped looking like a place where hope had died. Eli thrived. He learned to read full sentences without stumbling. He started asking questions about Charlotte's life in Boston, about the ocean, about cities he'd only heard about in stories. At night, he sat beside her while she read aloud from the battered storybook, his eyes wide and focused. "Do you think I could go to Boston someday?" he asked one evening. "Maybe," Charlotte said. "When you're older. Would you take me?" She hesitated. She didn't know how to answer that. She didn't know if she'd still be here when Eli was old enough to leave. She didn't know if this fragile arrangement would last a month, let alone years. "We'll see," she said finally. Silas was standing in the doorway. Charlotte hadn't heard him come in. He didn't say anything. He just looked at Eli, something unreadable flickering across his face, and then he turned and went upstairs. 3 weeks after the wedding, Charlotte went into town for supplies. She walked into the mercantile, and the room went quiet. Women stood near the bolts of fabric, their conversations dying mid-sentence. The shopkeeper looked up from his ledger, his expression carefully blank. Charlotte ignored them. She picked out flour, sugar, coffee, and a tin of lard. She set them on the counter and counted out her coins. As she turned to leave, Eleanor Voss stepped into her path. "Mrs. Boone," Eleanor said, her voice syrupy. "How lovely to see you." Charlotte met her gaze. "Miss Voss, I heard about your marriage. Congratulations." Eleanor's smile was sharp. "Though I must say, it all happened rather quickly. Some decisions don't need long consideration." "Of course." Eleanor tilted her head. "Still, people do talk. A woman arriving from nowhere, marrying a grieving widower within days. It raises questions." "Let it." Eleanor's smile thinned. "You're very bold, Mrs. Boone. I wonder if you understand how precarious your position really is." Charlotte stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I understand that you filed a complaint to try to take my husband's land, and I understand that it didn't work. So whatever game you're playing, you'll have to find a new strategy." Eleanor's eyes glittered. "Oh, I will. Don't worry." She swept past Charlotte and out the door. The other women in the store whispered among themselves, their eyes following Charlotte as she left. On the walk back, Charlotte's hand shook. She'd made an enemy, a powerful one, and she had no idea what Eleanor would do next. That night, Charlotte told Silas about the encounter. They were sitting on the porch after supper, the sky fading from orange to deep purple. Eli was inside, already asleep. "She's not going to stop," Charlotte said quietly. Silas didn't answer right away. He stared out at the darkening fields, his jaw tight. "Her father tried to buy this land 10 years ago," he said finally. "Offered twice what it was worth. My wife and I turned him down. He died angry about it, and Eleanor inherited that anger." "Why does she want it so badly?" "Water rights. There's a creek that runs through my property and feeds into hers. If she controls both, she controls half the irrigation in this valley." He paused. "She'll do whatever it takes to get it." Charlotte's chest tightened. "Even destroy you. Especially destroy me." They sat in silence for a while, the crickets singing in the grass. "I'm sorry," Charlotte said, "for making this harder." Silas glanced at her. "You didn't make it harder. You just gave her a new angle." "That's the same thing." "No, it's not." He looked away again. "She would have found a way regardless. She always does." Charlotte wanted to ask him more, about his wife, about the years before grief consumed him, about what he'd been like when he still believed in things. But she didn't. The wall between them was still too high. Instead, she stood and went inside. Metz. Eli's birthday came in late August. Charlotte found out by accident when she saw a date carved into the doorframe of his room, August 24th, with a series of notches below it marking each year. "Is today your birthday?" she asked him at breakfast. Eli looked up, surprised. "Yeah." "Why didn't you say anything?" He shrugged. "We don't really celebrate it." Charlotte glanced at Silas, who was staring at his coffee like it held the answers to questions he'd stopped asking. "Well, we're celebrating it this year," she said. Eli's face lit up. "Really?" "Really." That afternoon, while Silas was out mending fences, Charlotte baked a cake. It wasn't fancy, just cornmeal and molasses, the best she could manage with what they had, but she shaped it carefully and covered it with a thin layer of honey. When Silas came in that evening, he stopped in the doorway. "What's this?" "Eli's birthday," Charlotte said. Silas's face went hard. "We don't." "I know you don't, but we are now." Eli stood beside the table, his eyes wide and uncertain, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to be happy. Silas looked at his son. Something shifted in his expression. Grief, maybe, or guilt, or both. He sat down. Charlotte cut the cake into 3 pieces and handed them out. Eli took a bite, and his whole face transformed. "This is good," he said, his voice full of wonder. Charlotte smiled. "Happy birthday, Eli." Silas didn't say anything, but he ate his piece slowly, and when he finished, he looked at Charlotte across the table. "Thank you," he said quietly. It was the first time he'd thanked her for anything. Basit. September came, and with it the first hints of autumn. The heat broke. The nights turned cool. Charlotte started preparing the garden for winter, pulling up the spent plants and covering the soil with straw. Eli helped her, his small hands working quickly. "Do you think the tomatoes will come back next year?" he asked. "If we take care of the soil, they will. Papa used to grow vegetables before Mama died." Eli's voice was soft, but he stopped after. Charlotte looked at him. Why? I think it reminded him of her too much. She didn't know what to say to that, so she just kept working, and Eli worked beside her, and the silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of things they both understood without needing to speak. That night, Charlotte found Silas in the barn. He was fixing a harness, his hands moving with the kind of automatic precision that came from years of repetition. "Can I ask you something?" Charlotte said. Silas didn't look up. "Depends what it is. Why did you stop growing vegetables?" His hands stilled. For a long moment he didn't answer. Then he set down the harness and finally met her eyes. "My wife loved that garden. She spent hours out there, planting things, talking to them like they could hear her." His voice was rough. "After she died, I couldn't look at it without seeing her, so I let it go. And now? Now it's back. Because of you." Charlotte's throat tightened. "I didn't mean to—" "Oh, I know." Silas picked up the harness again. "But some things come back whether we're ready for them or not." He went back to work, and Charlotte left him alone. In early October, a letter arrived. Charlotte found it tucked into the mail pouch the courier delivered once a week. Her name was written on the front in elegant, looping script. She opened it with trembling hands. "Dear Charlotte, I hope this letter finds you well. I heard through mutual acquaintances that you have relocated to Wyoming territory. I must confess, I was surprised by the news. I am writing to inform you that circumstances have changed here in Boston. My previous engagement has been dissolved, and I find myself reconsidering many of my past decisions. I realize now that I made a terrible mistake in letting you go. If you're unhappy in your current situation, I would very much like to offer you the opportunity to return. I can arrange travel and ensure you are welcomed back into society. We could start again, Charlotte, properly this time. Please consider my offer carefully. I remain, as always, your devoted admirer. William Thatcher." Charlotte read the letter 3 times. William. The man who'd broken their engagement when her father died. The man who'd married someone else within 6 months. The man who'd made it clear she wasn't worth the inconvenience of poverty. And now he wanted her back. She folded the letter and shoved it into her pocket. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, William's words circling in her head. If you are unhappy in your current situation. Was she unhappy? She thought about Boston, about the boarding house, about the cramped, airless life she'd left behind. Then she thought about the ranch, about Eli reading at the kitchen table, about the garden coming back to life, about Silas sitting across from her at supper, silent but present. She didn't love him. She might never love him, but she wasn't unhappy. 2 days later, Eleanor Voss came to the ranch. Charlotte was hanging laundry when she saw the buggy approach. Eleanor stepped down, dressed in a tailored riding habit that probably cost more than everything Charlotte owned. "Mrs. Boone," Eleanor said pleasantly. "I hope I'm not intruding." Charlotte set down the laundry basket. What do you want? Just to talk. Eleanor's smile was thin. Woman to woman. Charlotte didn't invite her inside. They stood in the yard, the wind pulling at their skirts. I'll be direct, Eleanor said. I know this marriage is a sham. I know you came here under false pretenses, and I know Silas only married you to avoid losing his land. Charlotte's stomach tightened, but she kept her face blank. Is there a point to this? Yes. I'm offering you a way out. A way out of what? This. Eleanor gestured toward the house. This half-life you're living. You're a smart woman, Charlotte. You don't belong on a failing ranch with a broken man and a child who isn't yours. You don't know anything about me. I know you came from Boston. I know you had a life there, a real life. Eleanor stepped closer. I also know your former fiancé is looking for you, William Thatcher. He wrote to me asking if I knew where you were. Charlotte's breath caught. You contacted him. He contacted me. Apparently you share mutual friends. Eleanor's smile was cold. He's willing to pay for your passage back to Boston. All you have to do is leave. Quietly. No fuss. And what do you get out of it? Silas loses his marriage defense. The morality complaint gets refiled. And when he can't fight it, I buy this land at auction. Charlotte's hands curled into fists. No. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. No? I'm not leaving. Even if it means going back to a man who actually wants you, a man who can give you the life you deserve. William doesn't want me. He wants the idea of me. And I'm done being someone's second choice. Eleanor's expression hardened. You're making a mistake. That's my decision to make. Fine. Eleanor turned back toward her buggy. But don't say I didn't warn you. This won't end well for you, Charlotte, or for Silas. She climbed into the buggy and rode away, leaving Charlotte standing in the yard, her heart pounding. That night, Charlotte burned William's letter in the stove. She didn't tell Silas about Eleanor's visit. She didn't tell him about the offer to leave. She just kept going. The first snow came in late November. Charlotte woke to a world blanketed in white, the mountains sharp and clear against a pale sky. Eli ran outside laughing and threw handfuls of snow into the air. Silas stood on the porch watching his son, and for the first time since Charlotte had arrived, she saw something close to peace on his face. He hasn't done that in years, Silas said quietly. Charlotte stepped beside him. Done what? Acted like a kid. They watched Eli together, and the silence between them felt different. Less hostile, less empty. I got a letter, Charlotte said. A few weeks ago. Silas glanced at her. From who? My former fiancé. He wants me to come back to Boston. Silas's jaw tightened. Are you going? No. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in weeks. Why not? Charlotte hesitated. She didn't have a good answer. Or maybe she did, and she just wasn't ready to say it out loud. Because I'm not finished here yet, she said finally. Silas nodded slowly. He didn't say anything else. He just went back to watching Eli, and Charlotte stood beside him, and the snow kept falling, quiet and steady, covering everything in white. Winter settled over the ranch like a hand pressing down, cold and unrelenting. The snow that had seemed beautiful that first morning turned into something harder to live with. Charlotte woke every day to frozen water in the wash basin and wind that found every crack in the walls. She stuffed rags into the gaps and kept the fire burning, but the cold still crept in. Silas spent long hours outside, breaking ice on the water troughs and hauling feed to the cattle. He came in at night with his hands cracked and bleeding, and Charlotte made him soak them in warm water while Eli watched from the table, his face worried. Does it hurt? Eli asked one evening. Silas flexed his fingers, the skin tight and red. It's fine. It doesn't look fine. I said it's fine, Eli. The boy went quiet, and Charlotte saw the familiar shutdown happening. Silas retreating, Eli pulling inward. She'd watched it enough times to recognize the pattern. Go get ready for bed, she told Eli gently. I'll come read to you in a minute. Eli left without arguing, and Charlotte turned to Silas. You don't have to snap at him. Silas pulled his hands from the water and dried them roughly with a towel. I wasn't snapping. Yes, you were. He threw the towel down. He needs to understand that things hurt sometimes. That's how the world works. He's 8 years old. He already understands that better than most adults. Silas's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He just stood and walked to the door. Where are you going? Out? It's freezing. I'm aware. He left, and Charlotte stood alone in the kitchen, the fire crackling behind her. She wanted to be angry at him, but all she felt was tired. Tired of the walls he kept building. Tired of watching him punish himself for still being alive. She went to read to Eli, and when she came back an hour later, Silas still wasn't inside. She looked out the window and saw a faint light in the barn. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and crossed the yard, the snow crunching under her boots. Inside the barn, Silas sat on a hay bale, a lantern at his feet. He wasn't doing anything, just sitting there in the cold, staring at nothing. Charlotte stood in the doorway. You'll freeze out here. Good. The word hit her harder than she expected. She stepped closer. What does that mean? It means I don't care. About freezing? About anything. Charlotte sat down beside him, even though the cold from the hay bale, seeped through her skirt immediately. That's not true, she said quietly. You don't know what's true. I know you care about Eli. I know you work yourself to the bone every day to keep this place going. I know I work because it's the only thing I know how to do anymore. Silas's voice cracked. I wake up and I work and I go to sleep and I do it again. That's not caring. That's just existing. Charlotte didn't know what to say to that. She'd spent 3 years in Boston doing the same thing. Waking up, sewing hems, going to bed, repeating. She understood the difference between living and just not dying. Your son needs more than that, she said finally. I know. Silas put his head in his hands. I know he does. But I don't know how to give it to him. I don't know how to be what he needs. You don't have to be anything except his father. I can't even do that right. Charlotte wanted to argue, but part of her wondered if he was right. She'd watched him with Eli, the awkward distance, the way he seemed afraid to get too close, like love was something that could be taken away at any moment, which, she supposed, it could be. She must have been something, Charlotte said softly. Your wife. Silas lifted his head. Why do you say that? Because losing her broke you this badly. He was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Her name was Sarah. She was from Iowa. We met at a dance in Cheyenne the year I came out here. He paused. She was the only person who ever made me feel like I wasn't wrong somehow, like I fit. Wrong how? I don't know. I never fit anywhere growing up. My family didn't want me around. Other kids didn't either. I was always too quiet or too angry or too something. He stared at his hands. But Sarah didn't care. She saw all of it and stayed anyway. Charlotte's chest tightened. How did she die? Fever. It came on fast. One day she was fine. The next she couldn't get out of bed. The doctor said there was nothing he could do. Silas's voice broke. I held her hand for 3 days while she burned up from the inside. And then she was gone. I'm sorry. Everyone's sorry. Sorry doesn't bring her back. Charlotte didn't argue. She just sat with him in the cold barn, the lantern flickering between them, and let the silence stretch. After a while, Silas stood. I should check the fence line before it gets darker. It's already dark. Then I'll use the lantern. He picked it up and walked out, leaving Charlotte alone in the shadows. She went back to the house and lay awake most of the night, thinking about a woman named Sarah who'd loved a broken man enough to make him whole. 2 days later, a rider came to the ranch. Charlotte was in the kitchen when she heard the horse. She looked out the window and saw a man in a heavy coat dismounting near the porch. Silas was already outside, his hand resting on the rifle he kept near the door. Charlotte stepped onto the porch, Eli behind her. The man pulled off his hat. He was older, with a thick gray beard and a face weathered by years of sun and wind. Silas Boone? That's me. Name's Garrett. I'm a land surveyor working for the territorial office. Charlotte's stomach dropped. This was it. Eleanor had found a new angle. What do you want? Silas asked. Garrett pulled a folded paper from his coat. I've been hired to verify the boundaries of your property. There's been a dispute filed claiming your southern fence line encroaches on adjacent land. That's a lie. I surveyed this land myself 10 years ago. Maybe so, but the claim's been filed, and I'm here to measure. Garrett unfolded the paper. Says here the disputed section runs along the creek bed. Silas's face went white. Who filed the claim? Eleanor Voss. Of course it was. Silas stepped forward. That creek's been on my land since I bought it. She's got no right. I'm just doing my job, Mr. Boone. I'll measure the boundaries, file my report, and the territorial office will make a determination. Garrett put his hat back on. I'll be out here tomorrow morning to start the survey. He mounted his horse and rode off. Charlotte looked at Silas. His face had gone from white to red, his hands clenched into fists. She's doing this because I wouldn't sell, he said quietly. Because I married you. Because she can't stand that I'm still standing. What happens if the survey goes against you? I lose the creek. And without the creek, the cattle can't graze on half the land. The ranch becomes worthless. Charlotte's chest tightened. Can you fight it? With what? I don't have money for a lawyer. I don't have proof beyond my own survey. He turned and walked toward the barn. I have nothing. Eli grabbed Charlotte's hand. Is Papa going to lose the ranch? Charlotte knelt down in front of him. I don't know, sweetheart. What are we going to do? She wished she had an answer. That night, Charlotte couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Eleanor's smile, about the way she'd stood in the yard and warned her this wouldn't end well. Around midnight, she got up and lit a candle. She sat at the table and pulled out a piece of paper. She didn't know what she was going to write until the words started coming. Dear William. She stopped, crossed it out. She wasn't going to ask William for help. She wasn't going to beg him for money or connections or anything else. That part of her life was over. Instead, she wrote a different letter to the Territorial Land Office, explaining the situation, asking for a fair review. It wasn't much, but it was something. She sealed it and set it aside to mail in the morning. When she looked up, Silas was standing in the doorway. Can't sleep? He asked. No. He walked over and sat across from her. He looked exhausted, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual. I'm sorry, he said. Charlotte frowned. For what? For dragging you into this. You came here thinking you were getting a new life, and instead you got this. He gestured around the dim kitchen. A failing ranch, a broken man, a fight you didn't ask for. I could leave, Charlotte said. Eleanor offered me a way out. So did William. Silas looked at her, and something flickered in his eyes. Fear, maybe. Why didn't you take it? Charlotte thought about that, about the real answer, the one she'd been avoiding for weeks. Because I'm tired of running, she said finally. I ran from Boston when everything fell apart. I came here thinking I could just start over. Pretend the past didn't matter. She paused. But you can't outrun yourself. And if I left now, I'd just be running again. Silas was quiet for a long moment. I don't deserve that, he said softly. Deserve what? You staying. Charlotte met his eyes. Maybe not, but Eli does. Something shifted in Silas's expression. Not quite a smile, but close. You're tougher than you look, he said. I've had to be. They sat in silence, the candle burning down between them, and for the first time since Charlotte had arrived, the space between them didn't feel quite so wide. Whoosha. Garrett returned the next morning with 2 assistants and a cart full of surveying equipment. Charlotte watched from the porch as they set up stakes along the southern edge of the property. Silas followed them, his arms crossed, his face tight with anger. Eli stood beside Charlotte, gripping the porch railing. What are they doing? He asked. Measuring. Why? Because someone says we took land that isn't ours. But we didn't. I know. Eli's voice dropped to a whisper. Are we going to lose the ranch? Charlotte put her arm around his shoulders. Not if I can help it. She didn't know how she was going to help, but she'd figure it out. That afternoon, she saddled one of the horses and rode into town. She went straight to the land office, a small building near the courthouse with dusty windows and a clerk who looked half asleep. I need to see the original land records for the Boone property, Charlotte said. The clerk blinked at her. You'll need authorization. I'm Mrs. Silas Boone. It's my property. Still need authorization from your husband. Charlotte wanted to scream. Instead, she smiled tightly. I'll bring it tomorrow. She left and went to the mercantile. The same women were there, clustered near the fabric, their voices dropping when she walked in. Charlotte ignored them and approached the shopkeeper. I need to send a telegram, she said. To where? Cheyenne. To the territorial surveyor's office. The shopkeeper raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. He pulled out a form, and Charlotte wrote out her message. Request independent verification of Voss land claim against Boone property. Survey appears biased. Please investigate. She paid for the telegram and left. On the ride back, she passed Eleanor's property. A sprawling estate with a main house that looked like it belonged in a city, not on the frontier. Fences stretched for miles, all of them perfectly maintained. Charlotte stared at it and felt something harden inside her. Eleanor had everything, land, money, power, and she wanted more. Well, Charlotte had nothing, which meant she had nothing to lose. 3 days later, Garrett finished his survey and filed his report. Silas rode into town to get a copy. When he came back, his face was ashen. They're saying the creek belongs to Eleanor, he said flatly. That the original survey was off by 30 feet, and my fence crosses into her land. Charlotte took the report and read it. The language was technical, full of measurements and coordinates, but the conclusion was clear. The Boone Ranch had encroached on Voss property. This is wrong, she said. Of course it's wrong, but it doesn't matter. Garrett works for Eleanor. He gave her the result she paid for. Can you appeal? To who? The same territorial office that sent him here in the first place? Charlotte's mind raced. What if we can prove the survey was tampered with? How? She didn't have an answer. That night she lay awake again, turning the problem over in her mind. There had to be something, some way to fight back. Around midnight, she heard a sound outside. Footsteps on the porch. She sat up, her heart pounding. The door opened slowly. Charlotte grabbed the iron poker from beside the stove and crept toward the doorway. A figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the moonlight. Don't shoot, a woman's voice said. It's me. Charlotte froze. Who's me? The woman stepped into the faint glow of the dying fire. It was Eleanor Voss. Charlotte's grip tightened on the poker. What are you doing here? Eleanor held up her hands. I came to talk. In the middle of the night? I couldn't risk being seen. Eleanor glanced toward the stairs. Is Silas awake? No. Good. Then we can speak privately. Charlotte didn't lower the poker. Speak then. Eleanor looked around the dim kitchen, her expression unreadable. Then she pulled an envelope from her coat and set it on the table. What's that? Charlotte asked. Proof. Of what? That the survey was fraudulent. Eleanor's voice was quiet. That my father falsified land records 20 years ago to expand our property illegally, and that the creek Silas believes is his actually is. Charlotte stared at her. Why would you give me this? Eleanor's face was pale. Because I'm tired. Tired of what? Tired of being my father's daughter. Tired of destroying people to get more land I don't even need. Tired of... She trailed off, then looked directly at Charlotte. I watched my father ruin lives to build an empire. And when he died, I thought I had to keep doing it. Keep proving I was just as ruthless, just as strong. And now? Now I realize I'm just as miserable. Eleanor's voice cracked. I have everything, Charlotte. Money, land, power, and I have no one. I go to bed alone every night in a house big enough for 20 people, and I wake up alone, and I spend my days figuring out new ways to take things from people who have less than me. Charlotte slowly lowered the poker. Eleanor pushed the envelope toward her. This is evidence that my father bribed the original surveyor to move the boundary markers. If you take this to the territorial office, they'll have to invalidate the current survey and restore Silas's original claim. Why are you doing this? Because I saw you. In town. The way the other women look at you. The way you walk in there anyway, with your head up, not caring what they think. Eleanor's eyes were wet. I've spent my whole life caring what people think, making sure they fear me, respect me, and I've never been as brave as you were that day in the mercantile. Charlotte didn't know what to say. Eleanor stood. If anyone asks, I was never here. Burn that envelope after you use it, and don't tell Silas where it came from. He'll want to know. Then lie. Tell him you found it. Tell him anything. Eleanor walked to the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I think you're good for him. For both of them. Don't let him push you away. She left, disappearing into the darkness. Charlotte stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the envelope. Inside were documents, original survey maps, letters between Eleanor's father and a man named Pruitt, receipts for payments marked boundary adjustment. It was exactly what Eleanor had said it was. Proof. Charlotte's hand shook as she read through the papers. This would save the ranch. It would destroy Eleanor's claim completely, but it would also destroy Eleanor. Charlotte sat at the table and stared at the documents until the sun came up. Ket, she told Silas that morning. He read through the papers, his face unreadable. Where did you get these? He asked. Charlotte hesitated. Then she lied. I found them in the land office. They were misfiled. Silas looked at her, and she could see him trying to decide whether to believe her. This would ruin Eleanor, he said finally. Yes. She'd lose everything, her land claim, her reputation, probably her property. I know. Silas set the papers down. We should do it anyway. Charlotte's chest tightened. Are you sure? She tried to take my land. She tried to destroy me. She deserves whatever happens. But his voice didn't sound convinced. Charlotte thought about Eleanor standing in the kitchen, her face pale and tired, admitting she had everything and nothing at the same time. What if we don't? She said quietly. Silas frowned. Don't what? Don't use all of it, just enough to prove the current survey is wrong. Enough to protect your claim, but not enough to destroy her completely. Why would we do that? Because... Charlotte struggled to find the words. Because mercy costs us nothing, and it might cost her everything. Silas stared at her. You're serious? Yes. He picked up the papers again, reading through them slowly. She doesn't deserve mercy, he said. Maybe not, but maybe we're not doing it for her. Silas was quiet for a long time. Then he folded the papers carefully and handed them back to Charlotte. Do what you think is right, he said. I trust you. The words surprised her. Maybe surprised him too, from the way his expression shifted. Charlotte took the papers and went to town. She gave the territorial office enough evidence to invalidate Garrett's survey and restore Silas's original boundaries. She kept the rest locked in a trunk under her bed. A week later, the office issued its ruling. The Boone Ranch's claim was upheld. Eleanor's challenge was dismissed. Charlotte waited for Eleanor to retaliate, to file another complaint, to come after them with something worse. But nothing happened. The winter deepened and life on the ranch went on. Christmas came quietly. Charlotte made a small feast, roasted chicken, potatoes, the last of the canned vegetables. She baked a pie with dried apples and hung spruce branches over the doorway. Eli's eyes went wide when he saw the table. Is this all for us? He asked. It is. Silas stood in the doorway, looking uncomfortable. We don't usually do much for Christmas, he said. Well, we are this year. They sat down together, and for the first time since Charlotte had arrived, it felt almost like a family. Eli talked the whole meal, his words tumbling over each other. Silas listened, occasionally responding, his guard lowering bit by bit. After supper, Charlotte gave Eli a present, a new book she'd bought in town with the last of her savings. His face lit up like she'd given him the moon. Thank you, he whispered, clutching it to his chest. Silas disappeared upstairs and came back with something wrapped in old newspaper. He handed it to Charlotte, not meeting her eyes. It's not much, he said. Charlotte unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small wooden carving, a bird, its wings spread mid-flight. The detail was incredible, every feather visible. You made this? She asked. Silas nodded. Used to carve things, before. Charlotte turned it over in her hands, feeling the smooth wood, the careful work. It's beautiful, she said softly. I thought... Silas cleared his throat. I thought you might like it. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. Something quiet and uncertain and real. I do, Charlotte said. Thank you. That night, after Eli went to bed, Charlotte and Silas sat by the fire. I don't know how to do this, Silas said suddenly. Do what? This. Being normal, being a person again. Charlotte looked at him. I don't think anyone knows how. I think you just keep trying. Silas stared at the fire. I spent 3 years wishing I'd died with her. Every morning I woke up and I was angry that I was still here. And now? He was quiet for a long time. Now I'm starting to remember why I stayed, he said finally. He looked at her, and Charlotte saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Hope. January arrived with winds that rattled the shutters and turned the snow to ice. Charlotte woke one morning to find frost coating the inside of the windows, delicate patterns that looked almost beautiful, until she remembered how much work it took to keep the house from freezing. She started the fire and made coffee, her breath visible in the cold air. Silas came down the stairs earlier than usual, already dressed for the day. Storm's coming, he said, looking out the window. Big one, from the smell of it. Charlotte had learned to trust his instincts about weather. How long do we have? Maybe a day, maybe less. He pulled on his coat. I need to get the cattle moved closer to the barn and reinforce the roof on the chicken coop. That wind catches it wrong. The whole thing will blow into the next county. What can I do? Silas paused, like the question surprised him. There's firewood that needs stacking near the door, and the windows need sealing better. We're losing heat through every crack. Charlotte nodded. I'll handle it. He looked at her for a moment, something unreadable in his expression. Then he headed outside, and she heard Eli's feet hit the floor upstairs. The boy came down, rubbing his eyes. Is Papa worried? He's being careful. There's a difference. Eli looked out the window at the gray sky. Mama died in a storm, a spring one, with lightning. She went out to bring the horses in and got caught in it, got sick after and never got better. Charlotte's chest tightened. She'd known Sarah died of fever, but she hadn't known about the storm. Does your father know you remember that? Eli shrugged. I never told him. He doesn't like talking about her. Charlotte knelt down in front of him. Maybe he's afraid it'll hurt too much. But that doesn't mean you can't talk about her. Not to me, anyway. Eli's eyes filled up. I miss her. I don't even remember her face that well anymore, but I miss her. I know, sweetheart. Do you think she'd like you? If she could meet you? The question caught Charlotte off guard. She thought about it honestly. I don't know. Maybe. I hope so. I think she would, Eli said quietly. I think she'd be glad Papa's not alone anymore. Charlotte pulled him into a hug, and they stood like that for a while. The kitchen cold around them, the storm building outside. Ishag. By noon, the wind had picked up enough to make the trees bend. Charlotte spent the morning stuffing rags into the window frames and stacking firewood just inside the door. Her hands were numb by the time she finished, even with gloves on. Silas came in covered in snow, his face red from the cold. Cattle are in, coops reinforced, we're as ready as we can be. How bad do you think it'll get? Bad enough. He looked at Eli, who was reading by the fire. We might be stuck inside for a few days. Hope you stocked up on patience. Eli grinned. I got a whole new book. I'll be fine. The storm hit just after dark. The wind howled like something alive, shaking the whole house. Snow drove sideways past the windows, so thick Charlotte couldn't see the barn 20 feet away. They huddled near the fire, Silas adding logs every hour to keep the heat going. Charlotte made stew with the last of the beef and some potatoes, and they ate without talking much, listening to the storm rage. Around midnight, something slammed against the side of the house. The whole structure shuddered. Eli jumped, his eyes wide. What was that? Silas was already moving toward the door. Stay here. You can't go out in that, Charlotte said. If something broke loose, I need to know. Then I'm coming with you. Silas looked like he wanted to argue, but he just handed her a coat. Stay close. They stepped outside into a wall of white. The wind hit Charlotte so hard she almost fell. Silas grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the side of the house. A section of the fence had torn loose and slammed into the wall. The boards were splintered, the posts ripped from the frozen ground. Silas had to shout to be heard over the wind. We need to secure it before it does more damage. They worked together in the driving snow, hammering the loose boards back into place with half-frozen hands. Charlotte's fingers went numb almost immediately, but she kept going. If they didn't fix it now, the whole fence would come down. When they finally got back inside, they were both shaking from the cold. Eli brought them blankets, his face pale with worry. Are you okay? Charlotte's teeth were chattering too hard to answer. Silas wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and guided her to the fire. Get warm, he said. I'll make more coffee. She sat close to the flames, feeling slowly coming back to her hands in painful tingles. Silas handed her a cup, and she wrapped her fingers around it, grateful for the heat. Thank you, he said quietly, for helping out there. You would have done the same. Most people wouldn't have. Charlotte looked at him. I'm not most people. Something flickered in his eyes. No, you're not. The storm lasted 3 days. They ran out of fresh food on the second day and had to live on dried goods and canned vegetables. The house stayed cold despite the fire burning constantly. At night, Charlotte could hear the wind screaming around the corners, and she'd lie awake wondering if the roof would hold. But it did hold. And when the storm finally broke on the 4th morning, the world outside was buried under 3 feet of snow. Silas went out first, cutting a path to the barn with a shovel. Charlotte followed with Eli, and together they checked on the animals. The cattle had survived, huddled together for warmth. The chickens were fine, though clearly angry about the whole situation. Charlotte looked out across the white landscape, the mountains sharp and bright against the blue sky. It's beautiful, she said. It's a pain in the ass, Silas muttered, already planning how to dig out. But Charlotte caught him looking at the mountains too, and she thought maybe he saw the beauty in it, even if he wouldn't admit it. Cheats. A week after the storm, a letter arrived. The courier had to ride in on snowshoes, the road still impassable for wagons. He handed Charlotte 3 envelopes and left without coming inside. The first letter was from the Territorial Land Office, confirming that the Boone property boundaries had been officially restored. Charlotte set it aside for Silas to read later. The second was addressed to her in handwriting she didn't recognize. She opened it carefully. Mrs. Boone, I wanted to write and thank you for your discretion regarding the documents you found. I know what you could have done with all of them, and I know what you chose to do instead. That kindness was more than I deserved. I've withdrawn all claims against your husband's property. You won't hear from me again. I hope you find what you're looking for out there. E.V. Charlotte read it twice, then folded it and put it in her pocket. She'd burn it later, like Eleanor had asked her to burn the envelope. The third letter was for Silas. She set it on the table for him. That evening, he opened it while Charlotte was washing dishes. She heard him go very still. What is it? She asked. He handed her the letter without a word. It was from a lawyer in Cheyenne. The territorial governor had received a formal complaint against Silas Boone regarding the legitimacy of his marriage to Charlotte Whitaker. The complaint alleged that the marriage was fraudulent, entered into solely to avoid legal penalties, and requested a full investigation. Charlotte's hands started shaking. Who filed it? Doesn't say. Just says it's from a concerned citizen. Eleanor? Maybe. Or someone else who doesn't like seeing me still standing. Silas took the letter back. They want me to appear in Cheyenne for a hearing next month. What happens at the hearing? They'll ask questions about how we met, why we got married, whether it's real or just legal convenience. Charlotte's stomach dropped. And if they decide it's fraudulent? The marriage gets annulled. I lose the ranch. You get deported back to Boston or wherever they decide to send you. They can do that? They can do whatever they want. It's the frontier. The laws, whatever the people in charge say it is. Charlotte sat down slowly. After everything they'd survived, the humiliation, the winter, the storm, Eleanor's attempts to destroy them, it was all coming down to this. A hearing in Cheyenne where strangers would decide if what they had was real. What do we tell them? She asked quietly. Silas looked at her. The truth. Which is what? He didn't answer right away. He just stared at the letter, his jaw tight. I don't know anymore, he said finally. Bus. They barely spoke for the next 2 days. Charlotte could feel Silas pulling away again, retreating into the silence he'd lived in before she arrived. He worked longer hours, came in late, ate without talking. Eli noticed. Did Papa do something wrong? No, sweetheart, he's just worried. About the hearing? Charlotte was surprised he knew. You heard us talking. I hear everything. The walls are thin. Eli's voice dropped. Are they going to take you away? I don't know. I don't want you to go. Charlotte pulled him close. I don't want to go either. That night, she found Silas in the barn again. He was mending a saddle by lamplight, his movements mechanical. "We need to talk about this," Charlotte said. "There's nothing to talk about." "Yes, there is. We have to go to that hearing prepared. We have to know what we're going to say." "What do you want me to say, Charlotte? That we're madly in love? That this was some romantic story instead of what it actually is?" "And what is it actually?" Silas set down the saddle. "A business arrangement, a legal convenience, two people trying to survive." The words stung more than Charlotte expected. "Is that really all it is?" she asked quietly. Silas looked at her, and for a moment she thought he might say something different, something true, but instead he just turned back to the saddle. What else would it be? Charlotte left without answering. She went back to the house and lay awake most of the night, staring at the ceiling. She thought about the past months, about teaching Eli to read, about fixing the house, about sitting with Silas on Christmas while the fire burned low, about the way he'd looked at her when he gave her the carved bird, about the way her chest tightened every time he walked into a room. She'd told herself this was practical, a way to survive, a way to help a family that needed her. But somewhere along the way, it had become something else. She just didn't know if Silas felt it too. The next morning, Charlotte made a decision. She found Silas in the yard splitting firewood. She waited until he set down the axe. "I'm going to Cheyenne with you," she said. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do. They're questioning our marriage. I should be there to defend it." Silas wiped the sweat from his forehead. "And what are you going to tell them?" Charlotte took a breath. "The truth. That I came here hoping for a second chance. That your son wrote those letters because he was desperate to save you. That we got married because it was practical and necessary, and because we didn't have better options. That'll convince them it's fraudulent." "I'm not done." Charlotte stepped closer. "I'll also tell them that in the months since, I've watched you work yourself to the bone to keep this place going. I've watched you try to be a father even when you don't know how. I've watched you slowly come back to life." Her voice caught. "And I'll tell them that somewhere in all of that, I stopped thinking of this as an arrangement and started thinking of it as my home." Silas stared at her. "Charlotte, I'm not asking you to feel the same way. I know you loved your wife. I know I'm not her and I never will be. But I'm asking you to fight for this. Not because it's a legal strategy, but because it matters." She turned and walked away before he could respond. They left for Cheyenne a week later. Silas arranged for a neighbor to watch Eli in the ranch. The boy clung to Charlotte when they said goodbye, his face buried in her coat. "You're coming back, right?" he whispered. "I promise to try." "That's not the same as promising you will." Charlotte pulled back and looked him in the eyes. "Then I promise I will. No matter what happens in Cheyenne, I'm coming back here. To you." Eli nodded, his eyes wet. The ride to Cheyenne took 2 days. They stayed at a boarding house the first night, sleeping in separate rooms, barely speaking. Charlotte lay awake listening to footsteps in the hall and wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake by coming. The hearing was scheduled for 10 in the morning on the third day. They arrived at the courthouse early, an imposing brick building that made Charlotte's stomach turn. Inside, a clerk directed them to a small room on the second floor. The walls were bare except for a portrait of the current governor, a stern-faced man with mutton chops. A panel of 3 men sat behind a long table. The one in the middle was older, with white hair and a face like granite. He introduced himself as Judge Callahan. "Mr. and Mrs. Boone," he said, "thank you for coming. Please, sit." They sat in 2 chairs facing the panel. Charlotte's hands were shaking, so she folded them in her lap. Judge Callahan opened a folder. "We've received a complaint alleging that your marriage is fraudulent, that it was entered into not out of genuine affection or commitment, but solely to circumvent territorial morality statutes. Is that accurate?" Silas's jaw tightened. "No." "Then perhaps you can explain the circumstances of your marriage." Silas glanced at Charlotte. She nodded slightly. He turned back to the panel. "My wife came to Wyoming because my son wrote to her. Eli's 8 years old. His mother died 3 years ago, and he thought I needed help. So he wrote letters pretending to be me." One of the other men leaned forward. "Your son committed fraud?" "He's a child. He was trying to save his father." "And you, Mrs. Boone?" Judge Callahan looked at Charlotte. You traveled all the way from Boston based on letters from a child? Charlotte lifted her chin. I didn't know they were from a child. I thought they were from a man who needed someone, and I needed a fresh start. So you arrived in Black Ridge expecting to marry Mr. Boone, only to discover he'd never heard of you. Yes. That must have been humiliating. Charlotte felt heat rise in her face. It was. And yet you stayed. His son asked me to, for 1 week. 1 week became permanent rather quickly. Charlotte glanced at Silas. He was staring straight ahead, his face unreadable. A morality complaint was filed, she said carefully. We married to resolve it. So the marriage was a legal convenience. At first. Judge Callahan raised an eyebrow. At first? Charlotte took a breath. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. At first, yes, it was practical, a way for me to have a home and for Silas to keep his land, but she paused. But I've spent 5 months on that ranch now. I've watched that family slowly heal. I've watched Eli learn to read and sleep through the night for the first time in years. I've watched Silas start to remember what it's like to feel something other than grief. And you believe that makes the marriage legitimate? I believe that makes it real. One of the other men spoke up. Mrs. Boone, do you love your husband? The question hung in the air. Charlotte's throat tightened. She looked at Silas, and his eyes met hers for the first time since they'd sat down. I don't know, she said honestly. I don't know if what I feel is love or just caring or gratitude for being needed or hope that we might become something more than we started as. She paused. But I know I wake up every morning and choose to stay. I know I look at him and see a man worth fighting for, even when he doesn't see it himself. And I know that if you annul this marriage and send me away, it'll break something in me that I didn't even know was still whole. The room was silent. Judge Callahan wrote something in his notes. Then he looked at Silas. And you, Mr. Boone? Do you love your wife? Silas's hands clenched on the arms of his chair. I love my first wife, he said quietly. Sarah. She was everything to me. When she died, I stopped being a person. I just existed, went through the motions, tried not to feel anything because feeling anything meant remembering what I'd lost. That doesn't answer my question. I know. Silas's voice cracked. The truth is, I don't know if I'm capable of loving anyone anymore. I don't know if that part of me survived Sarah's death. He looked at Charlotte, and his eyes were wet. But I know that Charlotte came into my life when I'd given up on everything. I know she stayed when anyone else would have left. I know she's given my son a reason to smile again. And I know that the thought of losing her terrifies me more than I'm willing to admit. Charlotte's breath caught. Judge Callahan was silent for a long moment. Then he closed his folder. This panel will deliberate and issue a ruling within 3 days. You're dismissed. They stood and left the room. Charlotte's legs felt shaky, her heart pounding in her ears. Outside the courthouse, Silas stopped on the steps. Did you mean what you said in there? He asked. Charlotte looked at him. Every word. Did you? He nodded slowly. Every word. They stood there in the cold morning air, the city bustling around them, and for the first time since they'd met, the space between them felt like something that could be crossed. But they had to wait 3 days for the ruling. 3 days of staying in the boarding house, eating meals in silence, lying awake at night wondering what would happen. On the second day, Charlotte went for a walk through Cheyenne. It was bigger than Black Ridge, with paved streets and brick buildings and people dressed in city clothes. It reminded her of Boston, and the reminder made her chest ache. She passed a dress shop with a window display of silk gowns, a restaurant with white tablecloths, a theater advertising a performance of Hamlet. A year ago, she would have wanted all of it, the refinement, the culture, the sense of being part of something larger than survival. Now it just felt hollow. She went back to the boarding house and found Silas in the parlor, staring at a newspaper without reading it. Can I ask you something? She said. He looked up. Yeah. Do you ever wish things had been different, that I'd never come to Black Ridge? Silas set down the paper. Every day for the first month I wished that. I thought you were a mistake, a complication I didn't need. And now? Now I think you might be the best mistake I ever made. Charlotte felt something break open in her chest. She sat down beside him. I'm scared, she admitted, of what they'll decide, of losing this. Me too. They sat together in the quiet parlor, the clock on the mantel ticking steadily, and Charlotte realized that whatever the panel decided, she'd already made her choice. She was staying, one way or another. Shamit. On the third day, they returned to the courthouse. Judge Callahan sat behind his desk, the same stern expression on his face. The other two panel members flanked him. Mr. and Mrs. Boone, he said, this panel has reviewed the evidence and testimony regarding the legitimacy of your marriage. Charlotte's heart pounded so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. While the circumstances of your marriage are certainly unconventional, and while it's clear that practical considerations played a role in your decision to wed, we find no evidence of deliberate fraud or malicious intent. He paused. Marriage is a complex institution. People marry for many reasons: love, security, companionship, survival. None of these reasons are inherently more valid than others. Charlotte felt Silas's hand find hers under the table. Furthermore, Judge Callahan continued, it's clear from your testimony that this marriage, whatever its origins, has evolved into something genuine. The commitment you've shown to each other and to your family demonstrates a bond that goes beyond legal convenience. He looked at them both. Therefore, this panel finds that your marriage is legitimate and legally binding. The complaint is dismissed. Charlotte felt the breath leave her body. Silas's hand tightened around hers. Thank you, he said, his voice rough. Judge Callahan nodded. Go home, Mr. Boone. Take care of your family. They left the courthouse in a daze. Outside, the sun was shining, and the air felt warmer than it had in weeks. Silas stopped on the steps and turned to Charlotte. We won, he said, like he couldn't quite believe it. We did. He pulled her into his arms, and Charlotte let herself lean into him, feeling his heartbeat against her cheek. Thank you, he whispered, for staying, for fighting. Thank you for letting me. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the middle of Cheyenne while strangers walked past, and Charlotte felt something settle inside her. She was home, not in a place, but in a person. Chichi. They started back to Black Ridge the next morning. The ride felt different than the trip to Cheyenne. Lighter, somehow, like a weight had been lifted. Silas talked more. About the ranch, about plans for spring planting, about wanting to fix up the house properly. I was thinking, he said as they rode, maybe we could add a room, off the back, give you some actual space instead of that closet you've been sleeping in. Charlotte looked at him. You don't have to do that. I know, but I want to. They rode in comfortable silence for a while. Then Silas spoke again. Back in the courthouse, when you said you didn't know if what you felt was love. Silas, you don't have to. Let me finish. He looked at her. I don't know if what I feel is love either. I don't know if I'm capable of feeling that way again after Sarah, but I know I want to try. With you. Charlotte's eyes filled. I want that too. It won't be easy. I'm still broken in a lot of ways. I still have days where I can't get out of bed, where I forget she's gone and expect to see her in the kitchen. I know. And you're okay with that? Charlotte thought about it, really thought about it. I'm not looking for perfect, she said finally. I'm looking for real. And this, she gestured between them. This is the most real thing I've had in years. Silas nodded slowly. Then let's keep it. They rode the rest of the way home side by side. And when the ranch came into view, small and rough and imperfect, Charlotte felt her chest swell with something she was finally ready to name. Love. Not the easy kind, not the kind that came from romantic letters and promises, but the kind that was built, day by day, choice by choice, through storms and hearings and all the messy, complicated work of learning to be a family. Eli ran out to meet them before they'd even dismounted, throwing himself at Charlotte so hard he nearly knocked her over. You came back, you promised, and you came back. Charlotte held him tight. I told you I would. Silas watched them, and when Charlotte looked up, she saw tears on his face. Welcome home, he said quietly, and for the first time since she'd left Boston, Charlotte believed it. She was home. The days after they returned from Cheyenne felt different. Not perfect, not smooth, but different in a way that mattered. Silas started the addition to the house the week they got back. He worked on it in the evenings after finishing the day's ranch work, sawing boards by lamplight, measuring twice and cursing when the cut still came out wrong. Charlotte would bring him coffee and stand in the doorway watching, and sometimes he'd look up and catch her eye, and something would pass between them that didn't need words. Eli helped where he could, holding boards steady and handing his father nails. The boy talked constantly while they worked, asking questions about everything, and Silas answered more often than not now. The silence that had lived in him for 3 years was breaking up, like ice on a creek in spring, still there in places, but cracking. One evening, Charlotte found them both covered in sawdust, arguing about whether a board was level. "It's crooked," Eli said. "It's fine." "It's not fine, look at it." Silas stepped back and looked. The boy was right. The board tilted at least 2 degrees. "Damn," Silas muttered. He glanced at Eli. "Don't repeat that." "I already know all the words, Papa." "That doesn't mean you should say them." "You say them." "I'm an adult." "That's not fair." Silas pulled the board down and started over, and Charlotte saw him hide a smile. She went back inside before they could catch her watching. The room took 3 weeks to finish. When it was done, it wasn't much, just 4 walls and a window and a door that stuck when you tried to close it. But it was hers. Silas moved her narrow bed in from the kitchen and added a small dresser he'd found in the barn. "It's not fancy," he said, standing in the doorway. Charlotte looked around the space, at the walls that still smelled like fresh-cut pine, at the window that looked out toward the mountains, at the bed that was hers and no one else's. "It's perfect," she said. Silas shifted his weight. "There's one more thing." He left and came back carrying something wrapped in cloth. He set it on the dresser and stepped back. Charlotte unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a mirror, old and slightly tarnished, but the glass was intact. The frame was carved wood, intricate patterns of leaves and vines. "It was Sarah's," Silas said quietly. "Her mother gave it to her when we got married." Charlotte's hand stilled. "Silas, I can't." "Yes, you can." He looked at her. "She would want someone to use it, and I think she'd want it to be you." Charlotte's throat tightened. She set the mirror on the dresser carefully, like it might break if she handled it wrong. "Thank you," she whispered. Silas nodded and left her alone in the new room, and Charlotte sat on the bed and cried for reasons she couldn't quite name. Spring came slowly. The snow melted in patches, revealing dead grass and mud underneath. Charlotte started preparing the garden, turning over the soil that had been frozen for months. Her hands blistered and her back ached, but she kept working. Eli helped, digging holes for seeds and chattering about what they should plant. "Tomatoes for sure, and beans. Can we do carrots? I like carrots." "We can do whatever you want," Charlotte said. "What about flowers? Mama used to plant flowers." Charlotte paused, her hands in the dirt. "What kind did she like?" "I don't remember, just that they were yellow, and they smelled good." "We'll find some yellow flowers then." Eli grinned and went back to digging. That afternoon, Charlotte rode into town for supplies. The mercantile was quieter than usual, just the shopkeeper and one older woman browsing the fabric. Charlotte picked out seeds, tomatoes, beans, carrots, and added a packet of yellow zinnia seeds at the last minute. She was paying when the woman approached her. "Mrs. Boone?" Charlotte turned. The woman was maybe 60, with gray hair pulled back in a bun and kind eyes. "Yes?" "I'm Margaret Porter. I knew your husband's first wife. Sarah." Charlotte's stomach tightened. "Oh, I wanted to tell you—" Margaret paused, choosing her words carefully. "Sarah was a good woman, kind, strong. She loved Silas and that boy more than anything. I know. And I think she'd be glad someone's taking care of them now. Someone who stays even when it's hard." Charlotte felt her eyes burn. "Thank you for saying that." Margaret patted her hand. "You're doing good work out there. Don't let anyone tell you different." She left, and Charlotte stood at the counter holding the seed packets, trying not to cry in the middle of the mercantile. On the way home, she passed Eleanor Voss's property. The gates were closed, and Charlotte hadn't seen Eleanor since that night in the kitchen months ago. She wondered sometimes what Eleanor was doing now, if she was still alone in that big house, if she'd found any peace. Charlotte hoped she had. The garden grew. Slow at first, just tiny green shoots pushing through the dirt, but then faster as the days warmed. Charlotte watered it every morning, Eli beside her with his own small bucket. Silas watched from the porch sometimes, drinking his coffee, and Charlotte would catch him staring at the rows of plants with an expression she couldn't read. One evening after supper, he walked out to where she was weeding. "You brought it back," he said. Charlotte looked up. "What?" "The garden. I couldn't look at it for 3 years and you brought it back. It's just vegetables." "No, it's not." Silas knelt down beside her. "It's Sarah's garden, the one she spent hours working on, the one I let die because I couldn't stand the reminder." He pulled a weed absently. "And you made it live again." Charlotte didn't know what to say to that. "I'm not trying to replace her," she said quietly. "I know I can't. I know. And I'm not asking you to." Silas looked at her. "But I think maybe that's why it works. You're not trying to be Sarah. You're just being Charlotte. And that's enough." He stood and went back to the house, leaving Charlotte in the garden with dirt on her hands and hope in her chest. Kate. In May, the preacher came to the ranch. Charlotte was hanging laundry when she saw him riding up, the same thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles who'd married them in his parlor 9 months ago. Silas came out of the barn, his expression wary. "Reverend?" "Mr. Boone, Mrs. Boone." The preacher dismounted. "I hope I'm not intruding." "What brings you out here?" Silas asked. The preacher looked uncomfortable. "I wanted to apologize." Charlotte stepped forward. "For what?" "For judging you. Both of you." He took off his spectacles and cleaned them with a handkerchief. "When you came to me asking to be married, I thought it was a sham. I thought you were using the law to get around your problems. And I may have mentioned my concerns to a few people." Silas's jaw tightened. "You filed the complaint." "Not directly, but I spoke to someone who did." The preacher put his spectacles back on. "I was wrong. I've watched how you've conducted yourselves these past months, how you've built a home together, how that boy of yours has changed." He paused. "I came to ask your forgiveness." Charlotte looked at Silas. His face was hard, and she knew he was deciding whether to tell the man to leave or to let it go. "We all make mistakes," Charlotte said finally. "What matters is what we do after." The preacher nodded. "Thank you, both of you." He left, and Silas watched him ride away. "You didn't have to forgive him," he said. "I know, but I wanted to." Charlotte looked at him. Holding on to anger just makes it heavier. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he took her hand. The first time he'd done that when it wasn't necessary, when no one was watching, and squeezed it. "You're a better person than me," he said. "No, I'm just tired of carrying weight that doesn't belong to me." They stood like that, hands linked, watching the preacher disappear down the road. Summer arrived with heat that made the air shimmer. Charlotte worked in the garden in the early mornings before it got too hot, and Silas spent long days moving cattle and repairing fences. Eli had grown 3 inches since Charlotte arrived. His clothes were all too short now, and she spent evenings letting out hems and adding patches. "I'm going to be taller than Papa someday," Eli announced one night at supper. "Probably," Silas said. "Your mother was tall." It was the first time he'd mentioned Sarah without pain in his voice. "Tell me about her," Eli said. Silas set down his fork. "What do you want to know?" "Anything. I don't remember enough." Charlotte started to stand, thinking they'd want privacy, but Silas caught her eye and shook his head. "Stay." She sat back down. "Your mother," Silas said slowly, "was the stubbornest person I ever met. Once she decided on something, there was no changing her mind." "Like what?" "Like marrying me. Her parents didn't approve, said I was too rough, too poor, too much of a risk. But she didn't care. She said she'd rather have a hard life with me than an easy one with someone she didn't love." Eli listened, his eyes wide. She sang all the time. Couldn't carry a tune worth a damn, but she sang anyway. And she made the best bread. Better than anyone. Silas smiled slightly. "She used to say the secret was talking to the dough while it rose. I thought she was crazy, but it worked." Charlotte felt her chest tighten. "She sounds amazing," Eli said quietly. "She was." Silas looked at his son. "And she'd be proud of the man you're becoming." Eli's eyes filled. "You really think so?" "I know so." They finished supper in comfortable silence, and later, when Eli had gone to bed, Charlotte found Silas on the porch. "That was good," she said. "What you told him?" "It was time." Silas looked out at the darkening sky. "I spent 3 years trying not to remember her, trying not to feel anything, but that wasn't fair to Eli, or to her memory." Charlotte sat beside him. "You loved her very much." "I did." "And you still do." Silas was quiet for a long moment. "I'll always love Sarah. She was my first love, my first everything." He turned to Charlotte. "But I'm starting to think maybe you can love more than one person in a lifetime. Not the same way, but just as real." Charlotte's breath caught. "Silas, I'm not good with words. You know that. But I need to say this." He took her hand. "I love you, Charlotte. Not because you remind me of Sarah or because you're convenient or because I'm supposed to. I love you because you're you. Because you stayed when leaving would have been easier. Because you see me at my worst and don't run. Because you make me want to be better than I was yesterday." Tears ran down Charlotte's face. "I love you too. I've loved you for months, but I didn't know how to say it." "You didn't have to say it. I could see it in everything you did." He pulled her close, and they sat together watching the sun sink behind the mountains, and Charlotte felt something click into place. This was what home was supposed to feel like. Not a place, not walls and a roof, but this. Being seen, being chosen, being loved for exactly who you were. In late June, Eleanor Voss's property went up for sale. Charlotte heard about it in town, from the shopkeeper who seemed to know everything that happened in Black Ridge. "She's moving back east," he said. "Chicago, I heard. Said she's done with the frontier." Charlotte thought about that night in the kitchen, about Eleanor standing there looking exhausted and admitting she was tired of being her father's daughter. 2 weeks later, she rode to the Voss estate. The gates were open, and workers were loading furniture into wagons. Charlotte found Eleanor standing in the empty parlor, watching the house be dismantled. "I didn't think I'd see you again," Eleanor said. "I wanted to say goodbye." Eleanor smiled slightly. "I'm not sure I deserve that." "Probably not, but I'm doing it anyway." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Eleanor spoke. "I'm selling it all. The land, the house, everything. I thought it would make me feel free, but mostly I just feel tired." "What will you do in Chicago?" "I don't know. Something different. Something that doesn't involve destroying people to feel powerful." Eleanor looked at her. "You saved my life, you know. That night when you could have ruined me but didn't. You gave me permission to stop." "I didn't do it for you," Charlotte said honestly. "I did it because I was tired of carrying hate. Still, it mattered." Eleanor held out her hand. "Thank you." Charlotte shook it. "Good luck, Eleanor." "You too." Charlotte left, and as she rode back to the ranch, she thought about how strange life was. How people could be enemies and then just not. How forgiveness wasn't about the other person deserving it. It was about choosing not to let anger eat you alive. Tit. July brought storms and that rolled across the plains in the afternoons. Charlotte and Eli would stand on the porch watching lightning split the sky, counting the seconds between flash and thunder. Silas still got tense during storms. Charlotte could see it in the way his shoulders went tight, the way he'd check on the horses 3 times instead of once. One evening, after a particularly bad storm, she found him in the barn sitting in the same spot where she'd found him that winter. "Sarah died in a storm," she said. Not a question. "Yeah." Charlotte sat beside him. "You think about her a lot during these?" "Used to think about her all the time. Every second. It was like drowning in the memory." Silas leaned back against the wall. "Now it's different. I still think about her. I still miss her. But it doesn't pull me under anymore." "What changed?" "You." He looked at her. "You gave me something to hold on to besides grief." Charlotte leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat together listening to the rain on the roof. "I was so angry when you first arrived," Silas said quietly. "Angry at Eli for writing those letters. Angry at you for showing up. Angry at myself for still being alive when Sarah wasn't. And now? Now I think maybe Eli saved us both." Makik. In August, they had a small ceremony. Not a wedding, They were already married. But Charlotte wanted something to mark the change, to acknowledge that what they had now was different from what they'd started with. They stood in the garden at sunset with Eli between them. The preacher said a few words, shorter this time and without the formal language. Just simple acknowledgement that two people had chosen each other, were choosing each other, would keep choosing each other. Silas had bought Charlotte a ring. Nothing fancy, just a plain gold band from the jeweler in Cheyenne, and he slid it onto her finger with hands that shook slightly. "I know I'm not easy to love," he said. "I know I'm still broken in places, but I promise to keep trying, to keep showing up, to choose you every day." Charlotte's voice caught when she spoke. "I came here looking for a family, for a place to belong. I didn't know it would look like this, but I'm so glad it does." They kissed, and Eli cheered, and the three of them stood together in the garden Charlotte had brought back to life, surrounded by growing things and possibility. That night, after Eli had gone to bed, Charlotte and Silas lay together in the room he'd built for her. He traced the line of her shoulder with his fingers, gentle in a way she hadn't known he could be. "I never thought I'd have this again," he whispered. "Someone to hold, someone who stays." "I'm not going anywhere," Charlotte said. "Promise?" "Promise." He pulled her closer, and they fell asleep tangled together, and Charlotte thought about how strange it was that the best things in life often came from the hardest places. That love wasn't always the lightning bolt people talked about in stories. Sometimes it was quieter than that. Sometimes it was two broken people deciding to heal together. Sometimes it was a boy writing desperate letters and a woman brave enough to answer them. September came with cooler air and leaves starting to turn. Charlotte spent her days preserving vegetables from the garden, filling jars with tomatoes and beans and pickles. The pantry that had been nearly empty when she arrived was now stocked full, and every time she looked at it, she felt something settle in her chest. They'd made it through a full year, through winter storms and legal battles and all the messy work of becoming a family. One afternoon, Charlotte was in the kitchen when she heard voices outside. She looked out the window and saw Silas and Eli working together to fix the broken section of fence that had been damaged in the winter storm. Eli was hammering a board into place, his face screwed up in concentration. Silas stood beside him, not taking over, just letting his son figure it out. "Little to the left," Silas said. Eli adjusted. "That's it. Now hit it hard." The nails sank in clean, and Eli stepped back to admire his work. "I did it! You did good, son." Eli beamed, and Silas ruffled his hair, and Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes. This was what she'd crossed 1,000 miles for. Not romance, not adventure, but this quiet moment of a father and son learning how to be a family again. That evening at supper, Eli asked a question that had clearly been building for a while. "Can I call you Ma?" Charlotte's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. She looked at Silas, who was watching her carefully. "You don't have to," Eli added quickly. "I know you're not my real mother, but you feel like one. And I thought maybe—" Charlotte set down her fork. "Eli, come here." He came around the table, and she pulled him into a hug. "I would be honored if you called me Ma," she said, her voice thick. "So honored." Eli hugged her tight. "Thanks, Ma." The word hit Charlotte right in the chest. She looked over Eli's head at Silas, and he was smiling, really smiling, in a way she'd never seen before. Later that night, after Eli had gone to bed, Charlotte found the wooden bird Silas had carved for her at Christmas. She'd kept it on the dresser beside Sarah's mirror, and sometimes she'd pick it up and run her fingers over the smooth wood. Silas came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How far we've come. How different everything is from when I first arrived. You were terrified. I was humiliated and angry and completely lost. And now?" Charlotte turned in his arms to face him. "Now I'm home." Silas kissed her, slow and gentle, and Charlotte felt the truth of it settle into her bones. This was home. Not Boston, with its narrow streets and crowded boarding houses, not the life she'd left behind, but here. In this rough house on the edge of nowhere, with a man who'd learned to love again and a boy who called her Ma. October brought the first frost. Charlotte woke one morning to find ice on the windows and her breath visible in the air. She started the fire quickly and made coffee, and when Silas came down, he pulled her close before she could finish pouring. "Morning," he murmured into her hair. "Morning yourself. How'd you sleep?" "Better than I have in years." He kissed the top of her head and went to start his day. Charlotte stood in the kitchen and looked around, at the clean floors and mended curtains, at the table where they ate together every night, at Eli's books stacked in the corner, at the life they'd built together, piece by piece, day by day. It wasn't perfect. Silas still had bad days, days where he retreated into himself and couldn't talk about what he was feeling. Charlotte still woke up sometimes in the middle of the night, gripped by fear that this would all disappear. Eli still had nightmares about losing people he loved. But they showed up for each other. They chose each other. And that mattered more than perfect ever could. Later that week, Charlotte was working in the garden when she heard horses. She looked up to see a wagon coming down the road, the same courier who brought mail, but this time with a passenger. Charlotte's heart stopped. William Thatcher stepped down from the wagon, dressed in an expensive suit that looked ridiculous out here, his hair perfectly styled. Charlotte stood slowly, wiping dirt from her hands. "William, what are you doing here?" "Charlotte." He looked relieved to see her. "Thank heavens. I was worried you'd moved again." "I didn't move. This is where I live." William looked around at the ranch, his nose wrinkling slightly. "Yes, I can see that." He stepped closer. "Charlotte, I came to bring you home." "I am home." "I mean to Boston, to civilization. To the life you were meant to have." Charlotte felt anger rising in her chest. "I have a life here." "Living on a failing ranch with a widower and his child? That's not a life, Charlotte. That's survival." William reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "I know I hurt you. I know I made mistakes. But I'm here now. I'm offering you a real future." "I already have a future." "With him?" William gestured toward the house. "With a man who married you out of desperation? With a man who chose me, who keeps choosing me, every single day?" William's face hardened. "You're wasting yourself here." "No." Charlotte stepped closer, and her voice came out stronger than she expected. "For the first time in my life, I'm not wasting myself. I'm building something real, something that matters. And I'm doing it with people who see me for who I actually am, not who they want me to be." "Charlotte?" "Go home, William. Find someone who wants the life you're offering, because it's not me. It never was." She turned and walked away. Behind her, she heard William say something else, but she didn't stop. She went into the house and closed the door. Silas was standing in the kitchen. He'd clearly heard everything. "You okay?" he asked. Charlotte nodded, and then she laughed. Not because it was funny, but because she felt lighter than she had in years. "I'm perfect," she said. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Silas crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, and Charlotte pressed her face against his chest and breathed in the smell of hay and leather and home. Outside, she heard the wagon pull away, taking William and his fancy suit and his empty promises back to wherever he'd come from. And Charlotte didn't look back. Winter came again, as it always did, but this time Charlotte was ready for it. The pantry was full, the windows were sealed, the firewood was stacked high. And this time, she wasn't facing it alone. On the first snow day, Eli ran outside just like he had the year before. But this time, Silas went with him, and Charlotte watched from the porch as father and son threw snowballs and built a lopsided snowman. Silas's laughter carried across the yard, and Charlotte thought about the broken man who told her to leave a year ago. The man who'd spent 3 years disappearing into grief. He was still there sometimes. The grief hadn't disappeared, but it didn't consume him anymore. That night they sat by the fire together, all 3 of them. Eli read aloud from his book, stumbling over some of the harder words but getting most of them right. Silas listened with his eyes closed, and Charlotte worked on mending a pair of Eli's pants. It was ordinary, quiet, nothing special, and it was everything. Later, after Eli had gone to bed, Charlotte and Silas stood at the window looking out at the snow-covered landscape. "You ever regret it?" Silas asked. "Staying here instead of going back to Boston?" Charlotte thought about it honestly, about the life she'd left behind, about William's offer, about all the roads not taken. "Not once," she said. "Even when it's hard? Especially when it's hard. Because hard means it matters. Silas pulled her close. I love you. I love you too. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other, while the snow fell outside and the fire burned warm behind them. Charlotte had learned something in the year since she'd arrived in Black Ridge. She'd learned that family wasn't always blood, that home wasn't always the place you were born, that love wasn't always lightning. Sometimes it was the slow work of two people choosing each other day after day, building something real out of broken pieces. She'd learned that the bravest thing you could do was stay, was show up, was keep trying even when it hurt. She'd learned that second chances didn't look like you expected them to. They didn't come wrapped in pretty paper with guarantees attached. They came disguised as disasters and humiliations and desperate letters from 8-year-old boys. But if you were brave enough to take them, brave enough to stay when leaving would be easier, brave enough to love when loving felt impossible, they could change everything. Charlotte looked at her reflection in the window, at the woman staring back at her. She barely recognized herself from a year ago. That woman had been scared and lost and running from everything that hurt. This woman was rooted, not perfect, not unbroken, but home. Behind them, Eli called out in his sleep, and Silas went to check on him. Charlotte heard his low voice soothing the boy back to sleep, and her chest swelled with something she couldn't name. This was her family, built from nothing, held together by choice and courage and the stubborn refusal to give up on each other. And it was enough, more than enough. It was everything. Spring came again, as it always did. The snow melted. The garden grew. The ranch came back to life. Charlotte planted flowers this year, yellow zinnias, the kind Sarah used to love. They bloomed in late May, bright against the brown earth, and Eli picked one to put on the table every morning. Mama would like this, he said one day. I think so too, Charlotte agreed. Do you think she knows that we're okay now? Charlotte looked at this boy who'd written desperate letters to save his father. This boy who'd lost so much and still had the courage to love. I think she knows, she said, and I think she's glad. Eli nodded and went back to his reading, and Charlotte went back to her work, and the ordinary rhythm of their days continued. Because that's what life was, really. Not the dramatic moments, not the big declarations, but the ordinary days stacked one on top of another. The meals cooked and eaten, the gardens tended, the small kindnesses given and received. That evening, Charlotte stood at the back fence where Silas had brought her that first week. The mountains rose in the distance, purple and gold in the setting sun. Silas came to stand beside her, and they watched the light change together. You ever wonder what would have happened if Eli hadn't written those letters? He asked. All the time. And? Charlotte thought about it. About the boarding house in Boston. About William's hollow promises. About the life she might have lived if a desperate 8-year-old boy hadn't decided to save his father. And I think we would have kept drowning, she said quietly. You and your grief, me and my loneliness. Both of us too scared to reach out. You think that's what we were doing? Drowning? I know it is. I was drowning for 3 years, pretending I was fine, pretending that small, airless life was enough. Charlotte turned to look at him. And then I came here, and you were drowning too. And somehow, we pulled each other up. Silas took her hand. Eli pulled us both up. Yeah, he did. They stood in silence as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and red and gold. I'm glad you stayed, Silas said finally. I know I didn't make it easy. I know I fought you every step of the way, but I'm glad you were stubborn enough to stay anyway. Charlotte smiled. Someone had to be. Charlotte? Yeah? Thank you for seeing something in me worth saving, for not giving up. Charlotte's eyes filled. You did the same for me. You just don't know it. He kissed her then, slow and gentle, and Charlotte leaned into him and felt the truth of what they'd built together. It wasn't the life she'd imagined for herself. It wasn't the fairy tale people wrote about in stories. But it was real. It was theirs. And it was built on the kind of love that didn't fade when things got hard. The kind that dug in deeper and held on. Behind them, the house stood warm and solid. Inside, Eli was setting the table for supper, humming tunelessly the way his mother used to. This was home. Not because it was easy, Not because it was perfect, but because they'd chosen it, because they'd fought for it, because they'd taken broken pieces and built something whole. And in the end, maybe that's what home really was. Not a place you found, but a place you made, with courage, with choice, with the kind of stubborn love that refused to quit even when quitting would be easier. Charlotte looked out at the Wyoming mountains one more time, and then she turned and walked back toward the house, toward Silas and Eli and the life they were building together, toward home. And she didn't look back, because there was nothing behind her worth returning to. Everything she needed, everything she'd been searching for without knowing it, was right here, in a rough house on the edge of nowhere, with a man who'd learned to love again, and a boy who'd been brave enough to ask for help. This was her family, her home, her second chance, and it was more than enough. It was everything.